part of the Royal Free Charity.
This is Royal Free Radio.
As I was saying, Frank Bayford is here. Now, he's a difficult man to introduce, really, because he has so many things that he does. It's almost impossible. We're going to talk about Chase Farm Hospital when it was first a school. We're also going to talk about his music and the composing he's done. Frank, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed for inviting me here.
It's our pleasure, and it's good to have you. I think the best thing we can do is make a start with, because I had no idea that Chase Farm Hospital used to be a school.
That's right.
So perhaps we could start with that. What type of school was it?
It was a poor law school. I have to give a tiny little bit of history just to tell you how it came into being. I'll keep the dates as few as possible. In the early 1700s, the Enfield parish rented a premises in Chayside, Enfield. Many people will know the site as being the site of the old St Michael's Hospital. Later on, they purchased the site, and then in 1827, they demolished the old workhouse and built a new one on the site, and that was for both adults and children. Then in the 1830s, there was the Poor Law Act, an amendment to that, and the running of the workhouses in the whole area was taken over by the Edmonton Board of Guardians. And the Edmonton Board of Guardians decided that of the 7 workhouses that they had under their control, they'd close 4 of them. They'd use the Edmonton Workhouse to house the able-bodied adults. The aged and infirm would go to the Hampstead Workhouse, and the Enfield Workhouse would be used to house the pauper children. Now, up to a point it worked. At least there was somewhere for pauper children to go. But in the 1880s, it was decided that really and truly they needed in Enfield a purpose-built school to house children and to educate children. And the Board of Guardians looked round, and eventually they decided to buy a 40-acre site along the Ridgeway. Now, you might be interested to know how much that 40-acre site cost then. £12,000. I just wonder what the 12-acre site along the Ridgeway would fetch nowadays.
A lot more, definitely, yes.
They had their own architect, a chap called Mr. Knightley, and he designed the schools, and the total cost was £55,500. It was built to house in excess of 500 children. So you can see what the local problem was.
And these children were from a very poor background, I assume.
Yes, indeed. People have said to me, oh, it was an orphanage, wasn't it? Well, yes, up to a point it was. They did take in orphan children, but sometimes they took in children who needed some form of care because of their family situation. And there used to be something called the Creed Register, and I've got 1 or 2 entries from the Creed Register which gives details of children who were admitted there. For example, one of them says, both parents in prison, 4 children requiring some form of care. The next one, father in prison, mother dead, again about half a dozen children requiring care. Gosh. The next one, mother in hospital, father in the lunatic asylum, 3 children requiring care. Another one, both parents in the fever hospital, and again about 4 or 5 children requiring some form of temporary care. And there was a very sad little entry, which was about a little girl who was found abandoned and named after the street in which she was found. Now, when I retired from the health service some years ago, I became part of something called the Chase Farm Archive Group. I think I'm the only surviving member of it now. But people would learn about us, and people would get in touch and tell us stories about their parents or aunts or uncles who'd been admitted to Chase Farm schools. And we had a fascinating one. 2 cousins got in touch with us, and they told us about their grandparents who had a family of 8 children. But they were able to look after their 8 children. The father had regular work. The mother became pregnant with child number 9, but sadly died in childbirth, and the ninth child was stillborn. But the father was able to look after his 8 children simply because the 4 eldest were of an age when they could go out to work and bring in some money. That was until the day when he fell off a cart. One of the cart wheels went over his leg. He had to have his leg amputated.
Oh.
And so the 4 youngest children were actually put into Chase Farm schools.
The interesting thing is these entries all give you an incredible social history, don't they?
They do indeed. There's another one that I must mention, and I'm sure one day when I mention these names to at a talk that I give about Chase Farm schools, once upon a time there was a family called Elsie, Lizzie, Beatty and Ted, and they were all orphans.
They sound like a pop group, don't they?
I know
really?
it does, yes, a lovely name for it. But they were all orphans at Chase Farm, but they had an older sister called Jessie, and Jessie was in service. Whilst in service, she met a chap called Tom. They fell in love. They got married, and on Jessie and Tom's wedding day, they got a horse and cart and came up to Chase Farm schools and collected Elsie, Lizzie, Beatty and Ted and took them home as a ready-made family.
Goodness
so
me.
there were nice little rays of sunshine
Yes.
in many of these stories.
Yes. And also the thing that fascinated me was that from this background of being a school and looking after some very poor and needy people, it then transferred into a hospital somewhere or other, didn't it?
That's right. It remained as a school right up until 1938. It was opened in 1886, but by 1938 things had changed. Most of the older children, that is children up to the age of 15, Chase Farm schools actually took in children from the age of newborn babies up to children of 14 or 15. But by that time, the older children were being sent to outside schools for their education, and many of them were also sent out, rather than being resident at Chase Farm schools, they were sent out to scattered homes, what we call foster homes nowadays. So by 1938, there were very few children here, most of them very young children. In 1938, without any ceremony whatsoever, the younger children were moved out, and for just under a year it became an old people's home, and it was a very well-run old people's home. If you imagine an old people's home having swimming pools, tennis courts, lovely gardens. I always mention the gardens because during the day of the schools, my great-grandfather, one William Henry Weller, was actually the head gardener here, and according to my late grandmother, William, her father, is supposed to have laid out the gardens and grounds here. Whether that is actually true or whether it's family legend, I'm not quite sure. But in 1938, there was something formed nationally called the Emergency Medical Service, and this was because of the European situation, the rise of Hitler's Nazi Germany, and it was thought that, yes, there will be war sometime. So as well as providing various facilities, for example, issuing gas masks to children and to adults, a number of other things were done. And one of the things that the Emergency Medical Service did was earmark certain buildings for use as emergency hospitals should there be war casualties. And Chase Farm schools went from its second incarnation as an old people's home into an emergency hospital with connections to the London Hospital.
So what sort of facility would they have? I mean, did they have operating theatres?
Oh, they did indeed. They had operating theatres here. One of the fascinating things that they did was brain surgery. And somebody got in touch with me and said that one of his relatives worked at Chase Farm Hospital during the war years, and said that if you were a person who had a head injury, the best place in the country you could be sent to was Chase Farm Hospital, because they had two of the country's best brain surgeons working here. But they also had wards that dealt with burns cases from the bombings up in London. It's interesting because what happened was those casualties were brought up to Chase Farm Hospital at night using the old Green Line single-decker buses as ambulances.
Heavens, can you imagine it?
And I also heard from somebody who'd been a nurse here, and she said that one of the things that the nursing staff always did for these patients, she said the moment one of the patients from the bombing came up here, the first thing they did was actually wash their hair to make them feel clean. And she said as you wash their hair, bits of rubble and broken glass sometimes would come out from there. And this particular nurse also has some memories of one particular member of staff who was the night superintendent during the war. She was a lady called Miss Anthony, and she said Miss Anthony was one of the old style nurses. She said she was neat and tidy at all times, even when she was wearing a tin hat on her head during the air raids. She said Miss Anthony, although she was busy, she would always find time to speak to junior nurses if they had a query. And another thing that Miss Anthony did, sometimes young children would be brought in who were casualties of bombing raids. Nobody knew who their parents were or who their relatives were. Miss Anthony would get photographs taken of them and have the photographs published in the local newspapers to see if these children could actually be identified. And another thing that the nurse told me about was that they had emergency evacuation of patient drills carried out here. Now, I, as a pharmacist, whenever I hear the word evacuation, I think of laxatives, but this is not. But this is not about that sort of evacuation. This is if patients needed to be got out of wards if there was a bombing raid. And what would happen was the patients would be put onto their mattresses on the bed. The mattresses would be folded over them, and there'd be special straps strapping the patients in so they looked like the filling, the tobacco filling of a cigarette. And then using those straps, the patients would be lowered down the stairs. And as this nurse said, she said it was rather bumpy, but it worked.
To say the least, yes.
To say the least. So
nowadays they won't even move a patient without everything being absolutely
that's
solid.
Right. Another thing was I used to have in the Chase Farm archive a box which had been made on the premises by the hospital's carpenters, and it was the box that contained the emergency strappings in case they were. But the funny thing was about it, you'd think something like that would be needed quickly, but it had actually got a lock on the front, and there was a little glass panel which said, break this panel to get the key to unlock this box. I think they probably were worried that perhaps somebody on the ward might need the straps for something else, and when they needed them for the real purpose, they might have gone. So there we are. It makes me smile as well, because surely if you broke the glass, what did you break it with? If you broke it with your fist, you could end up being a patient with cuts.
Where have these artefacts gone now?
Well, after I retired, as I say, I became part of the Chase Farm Archive Group, and we collected a whole lot of things which we managed to stop being thrown out on the rubbish tip. And we had one of these, but that particular item, when we had to give up our archive room, I understand it was needed for more administrative space. We were able to send a lot of the items to the Forty Hall Museum, and amongst those was perhaps our most treasured item. That's going back to the days of the school. You remember I told you about the family of 8 children? Well, when the relatives came up to visit us one day, they actually brought with them a sampler, an embroidered sampler dated 1897, which had actually been done by one of their aunts who'd been a child at Chase Farm schools, and that actually now is in the possession of of Forty Hall. There were other places where we were able to send some of the things. For example, the Wellcome Museum took a number of the medical. The Wellcome Collection took a whole host of things. So we were able to disperse it to people who we knew would appreciate it.
And were you involved in the original time capsule, the one that we dug up the other day and put a new one in?
Well, I was asked to come along at the opening of the time capsule, and there was actually somebody from BBC Television there. Unfortunately, at that particular time, they couldn't get the items out of the time capsule, so they said, perhaps we could do your interview now. So I whittled on for about half an hour about life at Chase Farm schools, and I was very interested to see that the first introductory 10 seconds of my talk was used, and afterwards a celebrity historian told the rest of the story.
We've sort of skipped forward rather a lot, really,
Yes,
haven't we?
yes.
Because one of the things you haven't mentioned is that you were the chief pharmacist of Chase Farm.
I was, yes.
So you probably didn't start in that role. You probably started in a slightly lower role, did you?
I did indeed. After I'd qualified, I worked for a short time in a retail company which didn't sell shoes, although its name might have suggested it was. It did. And then I thought, well, I really would like to put the so-called skills I've learned to greater use. So I applied to Chase Farm and had a very nice letter from the then chief pharmacist, a wonderful man called John Soulsby. And at that particular time, he'd no vacancies, but shortly afterwards he wrote to me again and said that there was a vacancy for a senior pharmacist. So I went up and I applied for that. I got it, I think, because I was actually the only applicant there.
Always helps.
And chief pharmacist sounds very, very grand, doesn't it? If you knock out the word a senior and put general, and if you knock out the word pharmacist and put dog's body, I think that very clearly describes. I did quite a wide range of things in that situation. For example, one of my responsibilities was in the sterile products section of the pharmacy. In those days, we made everything. We used to make all our own transfusions. That was things like dextrose saline injection, a whole host of other things. We used to make all our own eye drops, a number of multi-dose injections, and the out of the sterile department, we used to make all our own ointments and mixtures as well. I was in that post for about 6 or 7 years, and then the deputy chief pharmacist decided that she would start a family, so she left, and I applied for the post of deputy chief pharmacist, and again obtained it, simply because there were no other applicants. I think that is because in those days hospital pharmacy was not as well paid as in general practice pharmacy outside. I was deputy chief pharmacist for a while, and then one Christmas, very sadly, Mr. Soulsby had a heart attack and died suddenly. And I did apply for his post afterwards. I was one of the senior consultant anaesthetists came up to me and said, "You are applying for the job, aren't you?" So I said, "Okay, yes." So I did. There were 2 or 3 other applicants then, but again, to my astonishment, I was appointed. And afterwards, one of the other consultants came up to me and they said, "We're glad you've got the job. Rather the devil we know than one we don't." So that's how I became chief pharmacist here. During my time, things altered quite a bit. We gave up hospital manufacturing and we started doing things called ward pharmacy, where members of my staff would go on the wards and check the prescriptions. But we also had to supply not only the wards here, but there were quite busy outpatient clinics where we dispensed the medication for those outpatients. And also I had responsibility for supplying medication and items to the various clinics that were situated throughout the borough. So it was a very interesting life indeed.
And you left that in 1988, did you say?
I did indeed. The circumstances were as follows. I did the most stupid thing imaginable. I actually went and had a heart attack.
Oh, not a good thing.
And ended up a patient on one of the wards there, the coronary care ward. I must say that I was very, very well looked after, but I do have one memory when I was a patient there. I have ears that hear things at a distance, and one day one of the student nurses was with ward sister in one corner of the ward getting the medicines ready, and I heard the student nurse say, "The little man in the bed in the corner, he seems to know a lot about medicines. Who is he?" And the sister said, "He's our chief pharmacist," to which the student nurse replied, "Oh my goodness, we'd better get his medicines right, hadn't we?" I must say they did, and they got the medicines right for everybody else in the ward as well. But,
So did that coincide with your retirement after the heart attack?
After I'd had that, I reasonably recovered. I then went back part-time for a short time and then started getting chest pains again. And my GP suggested that I might like to apply for early retirement. And I must say that I was seeing the way things were going in the health service at that time. And when I was told by the consultant, he said, "Well, you know, early retirement is probably best for you. Things are going to change. You've had what we call a yellow warning. If you have another one, it might be a red warning," and that. So
is that your health you're talking about?
That
Not
was
your
my health.
professional duties?
Not my professional, no, my health. So I must say I listened to the advice I was given, and in 2 minutes' time I decided that I'd retire. So to put it very crudely indeed, I'm afraid I grabbed my pension and ran.
Yes.
But I was able to keep myself occupied with various other interests. And
Which is what we're about to come on to.
Yes.
But we were talking in the other room earlier on, and because we also have a retired pharmacist that works on Royal Free Radio, Jeff Lincoln, who does the Friday night request show.
Yes.
And it turns out you know him.
I do indeed. I knew Jeff very well indeed, because he was a member of the local branch of the Enfield Pharmaceutical Society. He served on the committee of that group. I was a committee member. Again, I actually ended up for several years being secretary of that. But yes, I remember Jeff very well. Very, very pleasant gentleman indeed.
Lovely
And his
guy.
wife
Yeah,
there,
lovely
yes.
guy. So let's move on to this other ability you have of composing music.
Yes.
And we will be playing something that you have composed but not played. Someone played it, but we'll do that just before we finish. But how did this happen? How did you get into composing?
I think it was because when I was a schoolboy, I discovered something called the third programme on the radio and the home service. And I turned the radio on one day. I think I must have been about 13 or 14 at the time, and there was what one would call a classical music concert going, and somehow I got hooked on classical music. And I must say, during the summertime, when the proms were broadcast, I listened avidly to the proms and concerts throughout the year. I think sometime my school homework must have suffered, because I think I spent more time listening to music on the radio. And then the most vain thought came into my mind one day when I was about 17. I thought, I wonder if I can have a go at writing this, and I did. And thankfully, all those early efforts ended up on the bonfire. Thankfully, nothing exists from those days. I never had any serious or formal music training, but during my life, I met many people who were professional musicians, including people who were composers, and somehow I assimilated knowledge by listening, by chatting to people. And some years ago, I and some other people, we formed something called Compass Composers Association, which put on a series of concerts of new music by young composers. And I learned a very great deal from what those composers had. Another thing that happened to me, I started going to concerts of the then Enfield string players. And again, to cut a long story short, somebody asked me, would I like to do a review of one of their concerts? And that was in the days when we had the wonderful Enfield Gazette and Observer, which did publish concert reviews and reports of sort of local meetings and that. And after I'd been doing that for some years, one day a letter came in the post from the then secretary of the Enfield String Players saying they needed a new president. Would I like to become their president? And I put the letter down on my desk and covered it over, and then I uncovered it and looked at it again just to make certain I hadn't hallucinated the first time. And so I accepted. By that time, I'd written one or two pieces for string orchestra, and bit by bit they were played by the orchestra. I think one or two of the players were a bit puzzled by what I'd written, but there were one or two nice comments said. And then in recent years, the Enfield String Players metamorphosed into the Enfield Chamber Orchestra, and I again changed my position from being president to patron of the Enfield Chamber Orchestra. And with the extra instruments that they have, I now can write for slightly larger orchestras, and they've been very good in playing a number of my pieces. This year, they premiered my Second Symphony, and 2 years before that they premiered the first, and a year before that there was an orchestral piece I wrote. One of my composer colleagues, a chap called Derek Foster, it was his 70th birthday, and as he's had played so many of my piano pieces, I thought, well, I must do a little thank you to him. So I wrote a piece called O Bards with Cloudscapes as his 70th birthday present, and they and the orchestra premiered that. So I'm writing a new piece for them at the moment, but I take a long time in writing things. I like to get things done, and the manuscript score of the Second Symphony, which I gave to the conductor of the orchestra, a wonderful chap called Martin Smith. It's rather interesting when you look at it, because it's about 3 times as thick as what it started out to being, because my way of changing things is not by scrubbing things out. I actually stick bits of manuscript paper over the wrong bits and write on that. And in one or two places, the pages are about as thick as a piece of cardboard.
So it's like a collage almost.
Almost a collage, but I have another very helpful colleague who very kindly typesets all my scores for me, because one thing I think is most important for the players, for people who are going to do you the honour of playing your music. You don't expect people to do it, but if people do, then you have to thank them and you have to be respectful to them. And I always make certain that they have good legible typeset parts to play from. So yes, it's an interesting sideline. I used to call it my other secret vice when I was practicing as a pharmacist. But
and we also have a further Royal Free Radio connection there, because one of our team, Claire Scarf, also plays in the orchestra.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So we seem to be connected all the way around, really. It's quite amazing.
It's a small world.
Yes.
Where do they play?
The Enfield Chamber Orchestra, it gives its concerts in the Baptist Church down Cecil Road.
Oh, yeah.
But Martin has a number of other orchestras that he conducts, and I went over to St Albans at the weekend because he was conducting the Hertfordshire Philharmonia Orchestra in a wonderful concert of music by Elgar and Vaughan Williams. So
beautiful.
It's marvellous. Yes, indeed.
Frank, I could sit and talk to you the whole afternoon, but we can't do that. But what you've told us so far has been fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. And I wonder if we can finish with a piece of your music.
Yes, I brought on the off chance a CD. On it, there are 3 little piano pieces of mine, and one is entitled Welcome, and it's part of a 3-movement suite, which I wrote as another birthday present for another another composer colleague of mine, a chap called Marcus Blunt. He and his wife now live up in Scotland. They very much enjoy Scotland. But his birthday is actually on the 31st of December. And if you look in the calendar, the 31st of December is actually St. Sylvester's Day. So rather tongue-in-cheek, I called this piece a peat fire for St. Sylvester's Day. And the opening movement, which is entitled Welcome, quotes a Scottish folk tune called The Peat Fire Flame.
And it's played by?
It's played by the pianist Roe Hancock-Child.
Frank, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
We've enjoyed your company and all the interesting information you've imparted on us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Marvellous.
And here's the piece of music. Well, there you are. That one's entitled Welcome, and it's by Roe Hancock-Child, one of Frank's composed by Frank. Very interesting. Lovely to have him along. I've had a request.
Royal Free Radio.